So recently in the tabletop space, there's been a big trend towards licensing video game IPs. Now, this has kind of always been a thing, but it's becoming much more common, especially in the board game space, to put out games that are based on video games. We've seen The Witcher, Elder Scrolls, and even Call of Duty making the jump. As far as war games go, we don't see as many video game crossovers, but we do see plenty of licensed games, like Star Wars Legion, Lord of the Rings, and Game of Thrones. Although, interestingly, the X-Wing miniatures game, which is what got me into miniatures games in general, seems like it's heavily based on the X-Wing video games from the 90s, which I was a huge fan of. So I think that counts even if Star Wars wasn't originally a video game. But that brings me to the point of this video, because I think there are a bunch of video game IPs out there that would make really interesting additions to the tabletop gaming space. And I'm a little bit surprised that some of these haven't already seen some sort of adaptation. So before we get into my list, drop a comment below and let me know a couple of video games that you think you'd like to see a war game, a board game, or an RPG, and why you think they'd be a good choice. But let's get into it. So Halo as a franchise has had a kind of rough go of it over the past couple of years. While the video games have been getting better, I think that there's been a lot of stumbles and a lot of missteps along the way. And people are still very hot and cold on Halo Infinite. Then we have that TV show that they did, and honestly, I don't even want to talk about it. It was such a disappointment for me. But either way, I think the fan base for Halo is still out there. There's still a lot of people that really love those games, especially the first handful. And I think the Halo universe would be an excellent setting for a tabletop war game and an RPG. Shockingly, there's no official Halo RPG out there, which I actually find really hard to believe. I spent a lot of time Googling it just to make sure that it wasn't a mistake, and there's some fan-made stuff out there, but nothing official. I think the coolest thing for Halo, though, would be an army-scale war game along the lines of like a 40K or a Legion. Even though the main games are first-person shooters, we get a lot of little looks at larger-scale battles that go on in the background of those games. And then we also have the Halo Wars games, which are army-scale battles. Plus, a lot of that kind of stuff gets touched on in the books, and I think all of it would make for a really good war game. It'd be really interesting because just like Star Wars, there's a lot of different time periods and settings that you could work with in Halo, starting with the war against the insurrectionists, and then moving on to the Covenant War, eventually dealing with the Flood, and then the Banished. There's all these splinter cells of Covenant and alien races, and then moving on to the stuff with the Didact and the Forerunners. That's like 4 main factions right there, plus a bunch of smaller offshoots, and I think it could make for a really interesting tabletop game. Now, if you've been in the hobby for a little while, then you might know that they actually did 2 Halo tabletop games, Halo Fleet Battles and Halo Ground Command. They came out a couple years back by a company called Spartan Games. Now, those were 2 of the 4 war games that I picked up because I'm a huge Halo fan, and I actually really enjoyed them. I thought they were really good games. Halo Ground Command was a little bit controversial at the time because it was in 15mm scale, which is much smaller than something like 40K or Legion. And if I remember correctly, the stated reason for that was that they wanted the game to be small enough so that you could have something like a Scarab actually show up in the game, which would obviously not be realistic in a game that's 40K scale. If it was, it'd probably be like $600 and massive. This is a little surprising to some people, but just to give you a sense of the scale of a Scarab, they're almost twice as tall as an AT-AT from Star Wars, so they're really big. But anyway, a lot of people felt that the game would be better if it was in a more traditional scale, like a 28 or a 32mm, because it shows off the individual models a little bit better and things are a little bit bigger and some people think are cooler looking. Now, I think I can kind of see the argument both ways, but the one thing that I did think was a huge mistake with that game was that when they put it out, they set it at the Battle of Reach, which is not a problem in and of itself, but they didn't have the Master Chief in the box. As a matter of fact, the game lasted a couple of years, and by the end, there still was no Master Chief, which I think is a big mistake for a game that is known for the main character, Master Chief. You could play as Spartan 3s, but they should have had Master Chief right on the front of the box. It should have been the main selling point. But either way, both games were canceled when the company went out of business, and based on the rumors that I heard, it had something to do with the owner falling sick and then having a bunch of financial troubles, and he just couldn't keep the company going. So unfortunately then, the licensing agreement was canceled, and the whole game just disappeared, basically. There is a small community that's around on Facebook that still plays the game, so if you are interested in this kind of thing, there is ongoing support for the rules, and people have even added new units, and there's all kinds of cool stuff going on, so check that out. I'll put a link in the description. But either way, Microsoft, if you're listening, you should definitely go out there and try to find another company who wants to pick up the game. And I would love to see a war game as well as an RPG system. It would be awesome, even if it was just for the lore nerds out there who wanted to get some more detail about the background and the setting. They would be really cool, and I think people would really like them. This is another one that it seems impossible that this doesn't exist. Let me ask you a question. If they put out a series of high-quality plastic miniatures of Pokemon that you could paint, how many people out there would be able to resist buying any of them? I know for myself, there's probably a dozen or two that I would buy, even if there was no game associated with it, just to be able to paint them because they're characters that I really like from those games that I played all throughout my childhood. Pokemon is an IP that is already heavily merchandised. There's toys and figures and all sorts of different things that you can get for Pokemon. And it's the biggest entertainment intellectual property in the world. It's bigger than Star Wars. It's bigger than Mario. It's bigger than anything. Now, I know what you might be thinking. There's obviously already a Pokemon trading card game out there, and it's super popular and it's been going on for 20 years now. But I think a skirmish style war game would fit a very different niche than the trading card game, and it would be interesting to see them try to do both. I suspect that a part of the reason why we've never seen something like this before probably has to do with the agreement that they have with Wizards of the Coast, because Wizards probably doesn't want to see another company putting out a Pokemon tabletop game that they think would compete with the card game. But if that's true, I think it's really unfortunate because there's probably a good opportunity there for another game to come out, and it wouldn't necessarily compete. Now, you might also be thinking that a game like that would be too similar to the Pokemon trading card game. What's really the difference between having a card sitting there and a model if the game is more or less the same? And to that, I would say that I think they could do something that's much closer to a traditional skirmish-style war game, where you'd have a team of Pokemon that would go against your opponent's team of Pokemon and move around a small board and fight each other. Now, you might be thinking that that doesn't sound exactly like a Pokemon game because traditionally Pokemon is one-on-one fights where the Pokemon just kind of stand there and beat on each other. And occasionally there's more Pokemon involved, but aside from in the anime, you don't really see very dynamic battles. And to that, I would say that there was actually a game called Pokemon Conquest that came out back in the day that was a turn-based tactical RPG. Pokemon moved around on a grid and fought each other, kind of similar to something like a Fire Emblem. And I think it would be an interesting approximation of the way that a tabletop game could work. But really, like I said before, I don't care if the game is crap. I really just want them to put out some official Pokemon miniatures that you can build and paint yourself, because I think that would be really cool. I also think a Pokemon tabletop RPG would be great. Again, there would be a pre-existing player base for this game because Pokemon is so big, and it would be a really interesting opportunity to bring more people into this hobby space. I'm sure there's tons of people who got into other card games like Magic through Pokemon because it was a little bit more approachable and they were already familiar with the IP. So an RPG or a war game might get people into the hobby and into playing those types of games. Hey, so if you're enjoying this video, then don't forget to drop a like and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also consider sharing it with some friends that you think might find it interesting. And check out the links in the description below for a link to my Patreon, the Discord where you can come hang out and chat with me, as well as the merch store. But with that, let's get right back to it. Now, this is another one that's had kind of a rough go at it lately. The Mass Effect series was a classic. Those first 3 games, yes, I said 3, I'm an apologist for Mass Effect 3, don't at me, were absolutely fantastic. Mass Effect 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. And I think it's really a shame what they've been doing with the IP since then, which is to say kind of nothing. They did such a great job of building out that world and universe with all the different races and all the politics that were going on, the history of all the civilizations. There was so much interesting stuff there, and it's really a shame that aside from a handful of books and comics, we really never got a lot of side content or extra stuff to go along with that universe. I think Mass Effect could support a mass battles or a skirmish-style war game. Mass Effect 3 had this really interesting co-op multiplayer mode where you and a team of your friends would go out in like a horde mode style game against a bunch of opponents, which could be a really interesting premise for like a board game, one of those like dungeon crawler type board games that have become really popular lately. But it could totally support a one-on-one skirmish game or a full-on mass battles game. There's plenty of indications in the lore of things like that going on. And there could even be a fleet battles game. We see some big fleet engagements in that game, and it would be pretty sick to get a model of a Reaper to go up against a whole fleet of other ships and see how it works out. There was a whole Turian human war that took place long before the events of the video games that might be an interesting setting for something like that, although that would kind of limit the number of factions that could be involved. But there's a lot of deep lore there, and there's all sorts of stuff that could be mined. I really just want to get some Krogans on the battlefield. I think it would be really sick, and I'm already planning out my Krogan and my Geth armies, because those will be my 2 factions when they finally do the game. This is another one that seems like a super obvious choice for a tabletop RPG. There's so much lore there already that it would be really easy to fill a 100+ page reference book for an RPG. And I would absolutely love to play or run a game set in that universe. There's like a running joke in the Mass Effect community that we've always wanted to get like a police procedural that takes place on the Citadel. And if we got a tabletop RPG, you could totally make that happen. Plus, maybe some of the player characters can meet Blasto and they can go out and have all sorts of adventures with him, because he seems dope. Now, there are a lot of video game IPs that I love that have no presence in the tabletop space. So when I was thinking about this video and I was thinking about my top 5, the 5 that I would most like to see or that seemed the most obvious, a bunch of Nintendo characters came to mind. I'm a huge Legend of Zelda fan, and I was trying to think about if a Legend of Zelda tabletop game would work, and obviously an RPG could kind of be set in any universe, but it doesn't seem like a particularly good fit for anything aside from that. There's a few other Nintendo games that I think you could kind of shoehorn in, but there wouldn't really be anything special or anything particularly interesting, I don't think. And that's when I realized that there's a super obvious choice here. They could just make a Super Smash Bros. Tabletop game. I mean, the whole premise of that game is just, hey, we have all these really cool characters that people like. What if they all just got together and beat the hell out of each other? And that could be a perfect analog for a skirmish-style tabletop game with all of Nintendo's characters. If you've ever played Marvel Crisis Protocol, then you kind of get what I'm going for here. There's all these disparate characters from all these disparate settings, and they all have different abilities and ways that they can fight, and you can mix and match and team them up. And maybe there'd be advantages for teaming them up with light characters who would traditionally work together, but any character could kind of work with any character. You could build your little team of maybe 3 or 4 characters and go up against your opponent who did the same thing. And there could be items and stage events and all sorts of cool stuff. Again, there'd already be a huge player base for something like this because Super Smash Bros. Is obviously gigantic. And most of those Nintendo properties are super beloved and people really like them. So having the option to buy miniatures of those characters and put them down on a tabletop game would be really awesome. I don't know how much visibility this hobby has to a company like Nintendo, but they did start out as a trading card company, so they at least have some of it in their history. And I think it would be a really interesting opportunity for hobbyists who are into the painting side of the hobby because Nintendo characters tend to have that kind of cartoony look to them. And it would be interesting trying to decide how to paint a model of a character like Link, because we don't really see like a hyper-realistic version of Link. So would you paint him like a traditional way that you paint a miniature, or would you try to make him look more like a cartoon character? I think it would be a really cool project. Maybe Atomic Mass Games needs to get on the phone with Nintendo. So this is a little bit of a weird one. Now, obviously, Warcraft has become this huge thing with World of Warcraft. The strategy games were pretty popular back in the day, but World of Warcraft really became a monster of its own. I know every couple of years when they put out a new expansion, a bunch of my friends disappear into the void and they get sucked up by that game for a period of time. And it's like nothing's ever changed from the days when everybody used to just sit in their room and play WoW all day. There's obviously a ton of lore and background for the setting of Warcraft. And of course it had its beginnings as a strategy game, so that would make a perfect analog for a tabletop war game. Now this one's a little bit weird because legend has it that Warcraft was originally being designed as a Warhammer Fantasy Battles video game. And that at some point along the line, the deal broke down and they decided to branch off and make their own brand new IP without the Warhammer name associated with it. And that's why you see a lot of the similarities in some of the designs and some of the story. And then the same goes for StarCraft. You can obviously see the almost one-to-one comparison between the stuff in StarCraft and Warhammer 40k. So it would be really weird for them to come full circle and then take that new IP that they started in Warcraft and turn it into a tabletop war game. I think the reason that we'll never see this actually happen is because they would be going up against, very directly up against Warhammer and 40k if they were to do StarCraft. And when you're going up against the biggest kid on the block, it's going to be a really tough time. And that game would have a really hard time finding an audience of its own. But the reason that I put it on the list is because it's such a huge IP and it's really grown way beyond what it was originally when Warcraft Orcs vs. Humans came out. And it did have that kind of Warhammer foundation. Between all the other games in the series and then World of Warcraft, they've really expanded it way beyond what it originally was. And I think it would be interesting to see it come to the tabletop because there's so much else there now that kind of sets it apart from Warhammer. Again, the question would be, is it different enough from Warhammer for it to have its own audience? I'm not sure. But I guarantee you there's way more World of Warcraft players out there than there are Warhammer players. So if they could even get a reasonable percentage of those people that try picking up the war game, then maybe it could do well. According to a quick Google search, there's about 2.4 million Warhammer players out there and 130 million World of Warcraft players. So that should give you a good idea of the difference in scale between the tabletop hobby and video games. Warhammer is certainly the most popular game in this hobby space, and we're comparing it to World of Warcraft, which is not even the biggest video game. But either way, I think if we could pull more people from the video game hobby into the tabletop hobby, I think that's always a good thing. And making that transition easier and more exciting for those people is always good. So if they were to put out a Warcraft or a StarCraft tabletop game, I would be all for it. Alright, so that's it for my top 5 video games that should be adapted to the tabletop. So if you made a list before the video started, then how did my list compare to yours? And is there anything on my list that you think could take the place of some of the things that you picked out? Or are there anything that's on your list that you think I obviously forgot and I need to add to my list? There were a couple of honorable mentions that I wanted to just make at the end here because there was a bunch of other games that I thought might make an interesting addition to the list, but I thought that they didn't really make the top 5. The Command & Conquer series is really great, and I think it's obvious how that would translate to a tabletop game, but I'm just not sure if any of those games are different enough from a historical game to make them stand out or be interesting in the tabletop. Even the Red Alert games that are like alt history, I'm not sure if there's enough there to make them interesting in and of themselves compared to all of the historical games and frankly the other alt history games that are already available. I'd still be excited to see it, but not top 5. Next up is Dead Space. I think that series is really cool, and I would love to see a game like that come to the tabletop, but mostly I say that because I just want to paint up the miniatures. I'm not really sure how it would be adapted to a tabletop game well. I think maybe the best choice would be a co-op board game style, dungeon crawler style game, but there's so many of them out there right now, and some of them are kind of similar to a Dead Space vibe that I'm not sure if that would be particularly interesting. But I'd still love to paint the minis. And the last one I want to mention here is Final Fantasy. I don't think any one particular Final Fantasy game would be really good to adapt to a tabletop game, but if they were to do a Smash Brothers style mix and match for the different Final Fantasy games, I think that could be a really interesting way to do a tabletop game. They've already done video games called Final Fantasy Dissidia, which is a game that actually features characters from across all the Final Fantasy games. So there's already precedent for something like this, and I think that would be a really interesting way to do a tabletop game and allow us to get all of our favorite characters from across the series into the game. Now, in this list, I specifically avoided games that are basically just tabletop war games in digital form anyway. So things like Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy Tactics, you could pretty much just move those over to a war game by themselves, 1-to-1. And I thought something like that was a little bit too obvious, so I didn't include them in the list. So if one of those would be your top pick, then make sure you drop a comment and let us know. But that is it for me for now. But I'd like to send a huge shout out to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Black Ops Gladiator games. And thanks for watching.